Good afternoon, or good morning, good evening, and good night, I guess, for folks on YouTube or on LinkedIn or on Facebook. We're very happy to be with you. I am very excited to be joined by Laura Juarez, who's the founder of 10X Leadership Lab. And Laura's both a conscious leadership coach as well as a culture and strategy consultant. So there's a lot of expertise and definitely passion from my conversations before with Laura when it comes to better business is the way I refer to it, because conscious business to me is better business. And so we're going to take 45 minutes to unpack Laura's perspective on that. I love the concept, the conversation we're going to get into about the unlearning that Laura says as leaders we need to do. And I'm fascinated to hear about that, as well as what do we replace that unlearning with? What's that new foundation, that fresh foundation, and how to move forward from there, and what skills are necessary for competitive advantage. So Laura, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yes,
Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited that we get a chance to chat and have others listen in as well. So how long has 10X Leadership Lab been around?
So just over a year. So it's fairly new, and was birthed out of my desire to bring some of the practices and what I was learning and getting curious about into the privately held space with middle market companies.
Gotcha. And how are you finding it?
It's been great. I'm having a lot of fun with it, which should be a key performance indicator for all of our careers. And and the work is, I think generally speaking, everyone has such great intentions around some of the work that we're doing, which is around leadership evolution, right? What is conscious leadership? How do we become more conscious as leaders, thriving cultures, purpose-driven strategy? So there's a lot of interest in it. And it's just a matter of getting to the how. So that's what we're hoping to do, is to give that roadmap.
Gotcha. How do you define what a conscious business is?
I think this is such a great question. So when you think about the word conscious, we're really talking about a state of being awake, aware, and curious. And so it's from that place of being able to be both part of, but also curious about and an observer of what's happening in this space, so that we can think about what's possible. And so to me, it's this orientation of, we've got all the things that we need to do, but we keep one eye on what is the potential, what is the opportunity or the capacity or the possibility of the organization, the impact that it could make in the world that's positive and different, and the impact that our people can make using the business as a vehicle. So to me, conscious business is just simply a business that's living towards its potential.
Gotcha. And I'm going to sort of dive then with that wonderful foundation. I'm going to dive right into when we were having a chat about the potential for us having this connection online. And I was really blown away with the whole concept. You said, well, first I want to cover what has to be untaught, unlearned. And it's like, wow, there's probably so much there. And I'm curious, what do you mean by that? What needs to be unlearned?
Yeah, well, I mean, for a lot of us who have been leading teams and organizations for a long time, there's a lot that needs to be unlearned, right? Like, I think a lot of the traditional ways in which we've led and the ways we've been led, so what's been modeled for us, is not working very well. There's a lot that's changed. Expectations are changing. We don't get to opt out of some of these conversations. So, even just traditional organizational charts in a very hierarchical, top-down, command and control style, it's not effective anymore. And very prescriptive job descriptions that are task-oriented are no longer effective anymore. And so what are the ways in which we can think about, well, gosh, what do we know about what inspires people to jump out of bed and do amazing work? What inspires people to want to be part of teams and companies for the long haul? through thick and thin, good and bad, and making sure that we're designing our leadership and our cultures around those ideas.
Culture, definitely key point there. I'm sure you're familiar with Gallup.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm fascinated with. I love that organization. I went on a last year, one of their online programs, and received a book in the mail. So I was very surprised to get it. It's called Wellness at Work, and the first sentence starts out: "What if the next global pandemic was a mental health pandemic?"
Yeah.
And the sentence then continues on with, "It's already here."
That's right. That's right.
So extremely powerful, reality that we're living in. And what's your perception of any correlation that may exist, superficial or anecdotal? Maybe you've got some other data, and maybe it makes it not anecdotal, about the connection of how well a company understands their culture and what culture means, and how they're able to really get this unlearning that you're talking about and get this new foundation.
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty much everything. So, you think about companies always have a vision around the culture they want to have. And I always refer to that kind of, we have like an aspirational culture, just like we have aspirational values, things that we hope we're moving towards. But then we also have the actual. And sometimes the actual is quite accidental, where we have themes and ways of being showing up in our business that aren't really what we want, but they're happening as a byproduct of having not examined them. And there's that quote that talks about like the unexamined life, right? We have so many unexamined businesses or unexamined aspects of our business, and we can't do anything with them until we get to a clear understanding of as is. And if we have data around that, that's fabulous. If we have good feedback coming from the system, right, coming up from the company around what people are actually experiencing day in and day out in the working environment, this is really useful for us to get clear about how do we move from that place into what's possible or what we want more of. But to me, if we're not getting super clear on the as is, we have no baseline. We have no capability to even know the place from which we start. And notoriously, leaders underestimate the negative parts of their culture. Like we think it's better than it is because we want it to be better than it is. But we're not asking the questions. We're not bubbling up the intelligence of the system to really get that accurate picture. And culture is nothing more like it. I mean, I think culture has become this word that people are like, I don't even know what we're talking about anymore when we say culture. But culture really is just the way work happens. It's the environment, it's the relationships, it's the processes and systems, right? It's the operating structure that lives. It's the way we make decisions, the way we communicate, the way we hire, like all of the things that go into someone's experience of the company that they're working with. And so there's lots of aspects of it that we can address, but culture tends to get addressed with like these bolt-on programs, like employee engagement programs, or we're going to do this communication strategy or this awards system. But that's all kind of saddleback stuff. Like real systemic shift in culture happens when we start to embed the desired way of being into the way work happens every single day, and we give people a voice in it.
Isn't that then, Laura, the fundamental unlearning that needs to take place? Is that mindset that you just pointed out, that there's some external program or box to check. Oh yeah, we're going to include that, so and a day off, or we're going to put a vending machine in the kitchen or something.
That's right. Yeah. And all of those things are great because, part of our culture is the work environment we're in, but that's a little bit like, you think about Maslow's hierarchy, which is what a lot of culture assessment tools are actually kind of measuring against. It's a little bit like addressing the big lofty things when basic needs aren't being met. And so really being clear on what people want us to address. And I think one of the biggest unlearnings and it's a little bit of a relief to leaders is, hey, we don't have a know-it-all, and B, we don't need to have all the answers, because the answers actually live in the system. And the system being the team, right? They'll tell us if we have good feedback systems in place to draw that wisdom out in a safe way where people feel like they're part of creating what they want more of, versus feeling like there could be consequence to that contribution.
Yeah, gotcha. One would think it would be pretty consistent. You made the point that it's common for leaders to err on the side of on the positive about my culture, the level of engagement, people's attitudes about their role and responsibility and what they do in the organization is more positive than it really is.
Yeah.
That leads me to think, well, that's just anecdotal and they're guessing, and there is no measurement that they've done.
Right.
And what does that look like in terms of being able to get a measurement?
Yeah, well, there's lots of assessments out there that you can do. There's qualitative and quantitative. We use one that I'm particularly fond of called the Barrett Values Assessment, and it looks at culture based on alignment with values, and values not being kind of these qualities that we think about. Like, I think sometimes values get used as like, well, I have my core values and they're going to be my values for my whole life. But really, values defined as what's most important to us in the moment. And we know from research, and Barrett, which is why we love it, is so evidence-based. It's been around for over 20 years and has like 6,000 companies that have used it, including all of the big players like Accenture and Deloitte. But we know that when people experience personal values, like my personal values, what's important to me right now in my life, and they experience alignment with what they perceive as a reality in the business that they're working in, with also their future state or desired state for that business, right? When we can start to see that there's some overlap between my personal values, what I'm living in, and what I actually want to be living in, that's when we start to see really strong cultures where people are thriving and performing at peak.
Perfect.
So you mentioned Gallup, and I'll just comment on that for a moment. So Gallup's done a lot of extraordinary work around employee engagement, which is super important and one of the hallmark things that companies try to measure. They have their 12 questions that have a tremendous amount of evidence behind them. Marcus Buckingham broke off from Gallup, and he had been kind of part of that initial evidence build, and he's now working with ADP, and he has his 8 questions that are coming out of the advancement of his work. All of those are really interesting. I really see engagement as a critical piece of measuring culture. It's not the same they're not a one-to-one. It's just one part of it. So I think, that's another tool that companies can use to get a pulse, is just to ask those 12 questions coming out of Gallup, or the 8 questions that Marcus Buckingham is using now through his work with ADP. But this movement of prioritization of people towards wanting to be part of companies that share their values, and wanting to be part of companies that are making a bigger impact in the world other than product at a price for profit, right? Like, these are the real differentiators, I think. And they're not even really differentiators between like strong and weak companies, because they're becoming non-negotiables, where I think companies are going to continue to struggle with team and staffing stability if they don't have meaningful, like, teeth, right? It's like purposes that have teeth and values that mean something, and that we've figured out how to operationalize those because we know what they look like in behavior.
Fantastic. Gotcha. So I'm going to attempt to weave in the skills and behavior component of it. And I think I'll go in the right direction with this, in building on what you were mentioning about Gallup. Their research has been around for quite some time. It's global, but what first got me connected with them, that blew me away, is 3 in 10 people, quote unquote, are engaged in their work, which means 7 in 10 are not. It was getting better before the pandemic, but then it slid.
Right.
But supposedly it's less than 2 in 10 outside the United States, but it's about 3 in 10 in the United States, which means there are only 3 people in 10 where their heart walks in the door with their body and their spirit comes along for the full time there. Because this is what this means to me. If you're not engaged, that means your body's there, but only a portion of your mind, not 100% of it. But your spirit is nowhere to be found. Again, inspiration, to be inspired, that takes a level of engagement of people around you, your leadership and the whole organization. I think you nailed it with, right? What is the value system and where's the alignment to what the purpose of the organization is? It should ultimately be unspoken of the purpose of the organization is greater than the product, the service for the profit. But there's a good amount of unlearning, right? You pointed out that needs to go on, that gets people aware of a greater landscape.
Yeah. Well, there's a healthy tension, Christian, because I think, I led a manufacturing company for over 20 years, and the pressures are real, right? What leaders are dealing with right now in terms of this environment that we're living in and the inflationary pressures and the talk of the R word and the supply chain issues that are out there. For goodness sakes, the number of people that are just leaving jobs or switching jobs. I think it's really a hard time to be a leader of an organization. And so this tension between how do I sustain my business for the long haul, and then also how do I tend to these other things that I can't always see a direct link to the performance of my business. If I make a really good product, or if I close a new client, I can immediately see how that plays into my P&L, right? Like I can see the impact. But if I build a stronger culture or I focus on workplace wellness, right, I cannot as easily see the link. If I get really serious about defining what is the purpose of our company, right? Why does it matter that this company existed at all beyond this product that we make? What is the link of that? And so one of the things that we're trying really hard to do at 10X is to start to demonstrate that those are not trade-offs. That in fact, that the way we could think about making investments in our business are to focus on making those investments in culture, making those investments in meaningful purpose, that we put some energy behind, because that does in fact drive performance in your business. And there's some data around this. There's a great book called Firms of Endearment, but it was written a long time ago. And then there's also some good data coming out of the public arena, where publicly traded companies are starting to report on ESG and all of those things. And we're starting to be able to see correlations between the valuations of their companies and some of their commitments, but not as much of that lives in companies that are in the privately held space. And there's a lot of pressure on those companies. So I feel that tension. And so I never want anyone to feel like it's like a judgment, like, well, you just need to be doing these things, because it's hard. And it's hard to it's hard to invest that time. Everyone's really busy. It's also challenging to know for sure that it is going to have the impact that we need it to have, because we are in business to make a profit. Like that is part of why we exist. And that becomes the sustenance or the fuel for the sustainability of the business.
Yeah. But one would argue that that's an outcome.
Yeah.
Right. And not the sole focus of expectation. Right. Because if you, okay, we're here to make money. Okay, that's not entirely not true, but the way we started the conversation, that there's other fundamentals that are so critical and more relevant that get it from happening. And on the other side, though, too, if you're unable to be profitable, there's a great deal of pressure. We talked about the tension. The tension's probably most likely going to be sitting more on the what's it going to take right in the moment, right now, because if you can't survive as an organization, all this other value that you've been talking about can exist. So in that regard, it is a fundamental. It's not all the the rah-rah stuff, if you will, about culture.
That's right. Yeah.
It's a purpose outcome to it.
Yeah. We and one of the things that I love to remind myself and also talk to people about is, to say that because we get pushback on this a lot around, like, well, what is the relationship of what the work you're doing with profitability? And again, having run a company for a long time, I'm like 3 cheers for profitability. Like it matters. But we say all the time that thinking that a business exists for profitability is thinking that is kind of akin to thinking that the reason the body exists is the breath is the reason the body exists. Like the breath is needed, right, in order for the body to survive. That's the profitability, but it is not the reason that we live our lives is to breathe. And so it's just reorienting ourselves to understanding what the role of profitability is in the business, and that over indexing on profitability comes out of a very shareholder centric or shareholder primacy view on things, which I think is really getting turned on its head with companies starting to think about, well, who are my stakeholders? And how do I invite them into a conversation around what win-win is, right? So we're clear that our employees are stakeholders, our shareholders are stakeholders, our customers and vendors are stakeholders, communities, right? Cannot, in today's world, in my humble opinion, forget that the planet is a stakeholder of our business. And so what are our commitments strategically, non-negotiables? What are our commitments to creating real win-win outcomes with those stakeholder groups, creating trusting relationships and partnerships where we're creating co-elevation because we exist in relationship together?
Right. Beautiful. Exactly. Is there a particular mindset that you find is not fully engaged and aware of the perspectives that you're sharing, but there's enough of a opportunity for shift where it becomes understood and the unlearning takes place, and then the skill building for what you're talking about?
Yeah. I'm not sure I understand the question around the mindset. Maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Yes. There's a model I built called the 3-dimensional business model. It's shift, include, evaluate, and act. I did a lot of research getting my MBA in sustainability on the triple bottom line, which means nothing to a lot of people. Planet, people, planet, profit. Great. Got it. Okay. They converge together, and sustainability is in the middle where you converge people, planet, profit. Well, how do you actually go about doing that? And so every company that I've looked at, Walmart, Nike, Patagonia, list goes on and on, there was a shift. And that shift enabled them to include aspects of the company, all that you're talking about. And we've been spending the past 15 minutes talking about, requires a shift from a status quo of stakeholder supremacy. And I'm curious, in your experience, what's been your experience about this shift area that people need to go through?
Yeah. Well, I think I think that first of all, it's those shifts happen fundamentally at a very strategic level within the organization. They are not accidental, they are intentional. And so someone or a board or a team woke up and said, there must be something more here. And I find that a lot of business owners reach that point in their career where we've been working really hard to create businesses and do great work and develop products, right? And at some point we wake up and we think, is this it? And so for me personally, there was a shift to this recognition that my business and my role as a business owner and business leader was, I'd worked hard for it, but it was a privilege and it was a platform. And that platform could be used as a vehicle to do something extraordinary beyond just working really hard to deliver great products. And so that kind of more holistic thinking about the impact map, right? Like if we really step back from thinking, how do we generate return on behalf of our shareholders? And we think about how do we generate return on behalf of our stakeholder ecosystem? We've totally changed the frame with which we are thinking about the strategy of the business, the vision and the purpose of the vision. So to me, it's that mindset shift. It doesn't necessarily have to be a methodology, although there are methodologies out there that companies are using. I think B Corp is a great example of that. It's a very clear roadmap. ESG is moving in that direction where they're trying to get it to it's less of just a concept. And now they're moving it to measurement, right? Where we might actually redefine the way we look at the quote unquote financial statements of the business. But then ultimately there needs to be a pathway to achieve it. What's the roadmap to environmental sustainability? What is the roadmap to strong culture? But fundamentally, it's a shift in the way we think about the purpose of businesses. And I don't know, I like to just hope that we're having kind of a collective awakening and that businesses have a really important role to play, and that we've been dependent on perhaps or reliant on thinking other systems are going to play those roles, like our political system, like government, right? And I think we're seeing like they're not that effective at it. And business has a lot of leverage and a lot of good intent and a lot of wealth. And so could we all collectively do our part? And we don't all have to do it in the same way. But that to me is the mindset shift.
Perfect. Excellent. Let's gear shift with all that we've talked about. And I love to go there and be there. It's very esoteric, right? It's very philosophical. But there's the practical from what's necessary, and from a skill set standpoint and from a behavior standpoint. So I'm curious what your experience is, what your expectations are in terms of how you work with a company in that area for on the ground, being able to take the shift that they see they need to take and actually have it happen on the ground.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we've all experienced this where we go to a training or we hear a speaker and we get all fired up and we think we're going to change the world, and we go back and we keep doing things exactly the way we have always done them. And so, habits die hard and slow. And we use habit theory to really help teams, which are just a collection of people, to really think about how do we create sustainable shift. And so the first part of that process is always kind of rumbling with, what do we want? What is it we want to create more of? What can we get excited about? What feels inspiring? Because behavioral shift is hard. So we've got to be inspired and committed to it. And then how do we do that in an inclusive way so that we've brought in the voices of people that are impacted by the decisions and choices that we're making? And then more fundamentally, once we get clear on that and we're like, there's the North Star, like everyone can see, feel, touch, experience what it's going to be like when we get to that North Star. Now we've got to really break it down to talk about what are the behaviors that are going to support that? How will we recognize progress? What comes first, right? So that's a series of iterations around what's V1, V2, V3. We're not going to do it all tomorrow. And being patient in the process, like really appreciating the learning of the process. And so we work with clients to come up with what are the behaviors, what are the safe to try experiments we can run around those behaviors, and when are we going to come back and talk about that thing? And we do it in bite-sized chunks, because we also all know that when we set, well, if we set any resolutions at the beginning of the year, most of them don't get hit. But if we set 5 resolutions, we're just going to overwhelm the system. And so like, let's be really honest about what we know about change theory and as it relates to people, and move in a cadence that supports what the business can tolerate. Because the worst thing that can happen is we start to do things and then we fall off and it becomes flavor of the month, and then no one believes us the next time we come up with our next great big idea.
Well, they already have that walking in the door, right, from the past.
That's right.
To your point about the habit theory, lay out for me and talk a bit about the actual process. It seems as though there's hopefully some assessment that's gone on prior to your arrival, but your and your team's perspective is an outside perspective, so that's going to be really critical, and there's going to be a lot of aha. And it seems as though there's either a rounding of process, meaning that there's both education and engagement and awareness. So give me a sense of how that works.
Yeah. I'm a huge believer that we can come in with some ideas or some best practices, and at the end of the day, it's really customized to the company. So we believe that you meet people right where they are, and thus we've got to co-create those processes. And what is going to work with one company is straight up just not going to work with another company. And it's kind of on us, from my perspective, to figure out what that is. So we do have some baseline things that we always do. So we talked about the evidence earlier. One of the errors that I see leaders making is they're trying to solve things in a vacuum, and they're not really accessing the intelligence of the system. So we use baseline surveys to understand where culture is. I mentioned we use the Barrett Values Assessment, which I feel super strongly about. We also do leadership 360s. So we try to help leaders understand how they're being perceived and received by the organization. Because if we don't have the leaders on board and kind of demonstrating that they're committed and also making progress, that they're doing their own work, that they're being vulnerable and authentic about the work that they're doing, we can't expect the rest of the organization to trust what we're up to. So it's that demonstration that we feel really strongly about. So when we work with companies, like if we're doing work with a company that wants to do culture work, for example, like whatever that is, culture work, fix our culture, we don't do it unless you allow us to provide one-on-one leadership coaching with the key influencers in the organization, because otherwise it's just in a vacuum. And what happens is leaders very oftentimes well-intentioned, but because of their own blind spots, they can interfere with the work or stall the progress, because they aren't also doing their own work at the same time. So they just get in the way of the system. So that's one of the things we feel super strongly about. So we do the assessments and we work with leadership coaching on top of doing the culture work. And then we always take a stakeholder approach. So as broadly as we can, inviting in voices without creating too much chaos, although it is still messy, but really inviting in the stakeholder ecosystem to the extent possible, to really think about what is possible. What could we do together? Like, that's an interesting question, right? Like, you and I could be in relationship our whole life and never have that simple conversation of, gosh, what's possible for you and I to create together within our relationship, outside of our relationship, the positive impact we leave on the world, right? Like, these are all such great questions, and they're better questions that lead to better discussions.
Yeah, because it seems much more holistic.
Yeah.
You're having whole person communication and conversation.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it would be very difficult to not create a better engaged environment when you're having that type of engagement. I'm sure it's potentially uncomfortable for a lot of people because it's new, not something from a behavior standpoint that they've ever done before.
Right. Yeah. Well, and this is the work of Brene Brown. You know, her well-read research around vulnerability, around having difficult conversations, around showing up with your whole self, demonstrating your own humanness and authenticity to a group. Like I shared vulnerably myself. I do a weekly Wednesday wisdom, just kind of a short video. And I was talking about vulnerability, and I was commenting that, I have always tried to encourage it within my team and within any team that I'm working with. And yet I was terrible at being vulnerable in real life. And so as a result of me not being comfortable, that's where I get in the way, right? Like I'm trying to create something, but I'm not even willing to do it. And then I create this environment where people don't really feel safe doing it because I'm not doing it. I'm not modeling it, even though I'm saying it's encouraged. And so I think, leaders really need to be cognizant of the ways in which they're impacting the organization. And the toughest thing for leaders is they're not getting enough feedback. So nobody wants to tell the leader, those things. And it's really unfortunate. The person and the group of people in the business that probably need the most feedback get the least.
Right. Because the paradigm of the culture.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
My mind is just swimming with where do I go from here? There's so much that you're providing, and I'm going back sort of to some fundamental here that what you're sharing. As I mentioned before, it's better business, but it's interjecting things and aspects of humanity into a company, and a company is nothing more than a collection of people there to do a particular thing,
right,
for who they're there to serve. And so that said, this might be difficult to answer or not, so I'll just put it out there. From your exposure and experience, are there a particular sort of subset of or categorizations, if you will, of the type of either resistance or situation that you run into as you're unfolding what you're unfolding in your consultative and coaching work?
Yeah. I would say at the root of all of it is fear. And there's fear of getting it wrong. There's fear of not knowing. There's fear of feeling exposed. One of the hardest things for business leaders, and again, I speak from my own experience on this, so certainly don't want to put words into anyone else's mouth, but the environments we're living in, we've created. And the life we're living, we've created. And so if there are aspects of it that we don't care for, we built it. And so there's a real element of humility here, of recognizing that, we did our best in the moment, but we know better now. And we can see the things that we did that were harmful or that aren't serving, or maybe served at one point and just no longer work. And so having that agility to change. And I think leaders often get reinforced as the person that's supposed to have the answers, that's supposed to know. We think we're right. And that's systemically reinforced all of the time.
Right. Not only that you think you're right, that you're supposed to be right.
You're supposed to be right. Yeah. And so it can feel, I think it's quite lonely. I think it can feel like you're kind of on this island or on this pedestal, and the fall is far. And so I think that's a big piece of what gets in the way of leaders. And oftentimes, and again, I'll go back and just everyone's busy. I don't talk to leaders that have a lot of free time. And so, if we want something and we're not quite sure how to get there, I want to have an incredible culture. I can see where there's ailment or entropy in my culture, but I don't actually know how to roadmap to fix that. it's just easier for me to keep doing what I do know how to do really well. And so we just keep reinforcing and grooving the same patterns because that's the way we operate. This is why in our personal lives, we have the same arguments all the time with our partners, is we're not actually growing as a result of it. And so I really do think that, for everyone to remember, leaders are humans and having a superhuman experience. And there's a tremendous amount of pressure on leaders to hold the space for the whole organization, and not to underestimate the stress that comes with that.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. So on the skills and behavior, it's a pretty large tent,
Mhm.
right? That's incorporating what's traditionally, from a systems perspective, right? That of we are experiencing what we built. It's about, okay, what do we build? How do we build different? And what's the inclusive aspect to being more self-aware and holistic and whole body and whole mind in terms of the inquiry to start with, it seems to be.
Yeah. And you and I were talking before we went live about mindfulness.
Mhm.
And I have a steep background in yoga and mindfulness. And, for a long time, people thought it was kind of woo.
Mhm.
And now we're really understanding, oh, perhaps that's the gateway. Like perhaps
Oh,
just practicing more mindfulness as a tool, as a behavior, perhaps that's a gateway. And the other skills then follow more naturally. It's easier for me to be curious and to use inquiry as a tool
mm,
if I'm in a mindful space versus so driven and so fast that I'm not even noticing what I'm plowing over.
got it. So let go of the rightness
Yeah,
and the expectation that what your societal role is supposed to be,
right.
and be open and expect or offer the opportunity for others to engage, because a better outcome could most likely emerge when you involve others
Yeah.
and get out of that vacuum that you mentioned.
Yes, for sure, for
Yeah.
sure. And again, that takes pressure off also. And it's just remembering that, like the more our jobs as leaders is really to pull out the wisdom of the
Mm.
system and to inspire. And so if we could just be on the front edge, painting the picture, letting people feel and smell and touch and see that future state in a super sensory way, and then get really busy pulling people together, tapping into strengths, asking great questions, and empowering folks to go forward and do great work.
Yeah, that's it. That's phenomenal leadership, being able to communicate and express a situation, environment that does not exist,
Mhm.
that people can connect to. And there's talk about inspiration, talk about, okay, my spirit's coming in the door now, and then it's going to sit at the desk with me, or my stand-up desk, or
Okay.
that conference room.
Mhm.
Fantastic. So how do you see, and what's your perspective about the necessity of all that we're talking about, and how it actually can give competitive advantage to a company?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think they're conversations people can't tap out of anymore. I think up until a few years ago, companies could be like, "Well, that's interesting," and then tap out. And
Okay.
I think those days are over. So my theory is there's one thing that no one can copy about your business. They can copy your product, they can copy your pricing, your sales methodology, but they cannot replicate your people.
Mm.
And there is so much untapped potential that is living inside of the people that are coming to work every day. And, we're asking people, hoping that they will dedicate their careers to our business. And so we have a responsibility as leaders to make that worthwhile. So I think the competitive advantage is that this is the work that is going to sustain businesses moving forward.
Agreed. So how can folks find you?
So you can pop over and visit the 10xleadershiplab.com website. So it's just 10xleadershiplab.com. You can connect with us on LinkedIn. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, Laura Juarez, so Juarez. Happy to make a connection with you and support you in any way I can. So don't hesitate to reach out. You can also email me at laura@10xleadershiplab.com.
And I'll get on LinkedIn on Wednesdays because I always get extremely excited because you're on my feed a lot, which is great. And so I'm engaging with you, commenting wise on the great offering that you're providing the world, which is beautiful. And I'm very appreciative for you for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate it. It's been lovely to have this time with you.
Absolutely. So thank everyone for the future engagement in checking this out. And that wraps up episode 4 of Sustainable Mindset. Be well, everybody.
Bye, everyone.